Okay, here we go. Hey, event starting. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Atheist Reformation channel. Today we are having a live discussion between myself, your host, Drew, and Anthony Brooks of the Reformed View blog. All right, Anthony, give yourself a brief introduction, and we'll get started with discussing our arguments for the existence of God.
Hello, I'm Anthony Brooks with the Reform View blog. I am a Christian apologist and activist for multiple organizations, including Right to Life East Texas, where we try to uh, engage the culture and to establish the idea of the sanctity of life for all people, hopefully. In the future, we'll be able to uh, encourage more people to take up the stand for life, and through our blog, hopefully, we'll be encouraging more people to engage the culture and Christian apologetics. But mostly, most of my discussions happen uh, with people from a non-biblical worldview or a non-Christian worldview. So that is what we do at the Reform View, and that's what we do at Right to Life East Texas. Both of them are engaging the culture for a Christian worldview. So that's my introduction. So Thomas, what do you want to discuss first?
Okay, well, I would say that since we discussed presuppositional apologetics in our debate on the Reason and Theology channel, that we might look into doing something a little bit different. So I'll give you your choice. Do we want to go for ontological, arguments from design, or something, or you want to throw something out?
We can start with ontological. That tends to be a more difficult discussion that we can have, and it will take up a little bit more time. But I find the ontological argument to be head splitting, mostly. Um, Mostly from the premises that Anselm of Canterbury set forth, but there are actually multiple different syllogisms that have been set forth by guys like William Lane Craig that are really interesting to look at. So I would say we could start with the ontological argument if you want to.
Okay, that sounds good. So, let's see. Getting that pulled up now. And the most readily available one I have is going to be uh, Anselm's argument. You'll have to give me a moment to get it pulled back up. I thought I had it up and apparently didn't.
No, that's fine. I I actually have studied the ontological argument in depth, and it's a pretty interesting argument. Um, the most widely known syllogism for the ontological argument is not necessarily Anselm's. It's actually from William Lane Craig's um, Reasonable Faith ministry. Premise one is it possible for that a maximally great being exists? Premise two, if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. Premise three is if a maximally great being exists in some possible world, then it exists in every possible world. Premise four, if a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. Premise five, if a maximally great being exists in the actual world, then a maximally great being exists. Premise six, therefore, a maximally great being exists. That is a mouthful. Um, And what I found with this argument is not just that it's definitely hard to comprehend. It's that really premise 2 through 6 follows from premise 1. So the only part where the syllogism could possibly break down is premise 1.
Mm-hmm.
It is possible that a maximally great being exists. Um, so if premise 1 is true, then premise 2 through 6 are necessarily true. So the issue has to be taken with premise 1.
And yes, I would agree with that. So, what are some of the refutations or not contradictions, oppositions to it that you are most familiar with?
Well, I'm mostly familiar with those of Dan Barker and Christopher Hitchens, who are two well-known anti-theists. And uh, Dan Barker would take a longer approach to refute this argument. I just hit my mic there. Sorry. Um, they would take a he would take a longer route using the free will argument for the non-existence of God, or Tang, the transcendental argument for the non-existence of God, which I think are two very flawed arguments, at least from a theological standpoint. Mostly because he tends to make arguments that no rational, philosophically minded Christian would ever make, um, like the premise that God creates the laws of logic, which a philosophically minded Christian would never actually make that argument. The free will argument would take a position of free will that I believe is actually heretical for most Christians to take. Not to say that there aren't Christians who take that position. The idea that there's an idea of ultimate free will or ultimate libertarianism. Um, when, in reference to our natures and exactly how we move and act throughout the world. So those that would be the most common two most common arguments to say that God cannot exist. Um, with Christopher Hitchens, he takes uh, more of a transcendent reality type of argument, where he would say that God cannot exist because there is a reality in all of us that says that we do not act like automatons, that we act like free moral agents, and that if an all-knowing, all-powerful God does exist, and there's no way that we can have a measure of freedom in this world, and that we would have to attribute all evil to God. So those are the two most common opponents against the existence of God, and they would take aim at premise 1, like we were discussing in this argument.
Okay. Well, the one of the more common ones that I've seen are the ones that I've become more familiar with as of late was initially the Guanillo of Marmortier refutation of the perfect island as a challenge to Anselm's initial path of logic. And that was actually considered such a distinct challenge that even Anselm actually admitted that it depended on definitional ambiguity in a lot of ways. Also, I believe Immanuel Kant and Gottlieb Frege kept in that tradition in using Guanillo's reply whenever Anselm's syllogism had resurfaced. And modernly, yes, I've heard of Craig's version. Believe he also kind of leans a bit more towards, I believe it's Alvin Plantinga.
Yeah.
And his version. So there's actually a syllogism that's been used to kind of refute that. I cannot remember off the top of my head who actually wrote it. So if anybody knows after they hear it, please let me know. I would like to properly credit the author of this. And it goes with premise 1. A being has maximal excellence in a given possible world if and only if it is omnipotent, omniscient, and wholly good or omnibenevolent. And premise 2, a being has maximal greatness if it has maximal excellence in every possible world. 3, it is possible that there is not a being that has maximal greatness. Therefore, possibly, it is necessarily true that an omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent being does not exist. Therefore, it is necessarily true that an omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent being does not exist. And that's the axiom coming from Statement 5. And finally ends with, therefore, an omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent being does not exist. Now, Plantinga's version of the argument suffers from that same critical flaw of being really contingent on premise 1 and also premise 3. And this most recent syllogism, the one that I brought up, also suffers from a similar flaw, like Plantinga's, and that's actually in the formulation of premise 3. People refer to it as the possibility premise. There's not any reason to accept it. And it's the same with Plantinga's. Even he himself admits that there is no reason to accept it, and that he doesn't consider it a successful piece of natural theology. What might you say about that?
Well, I think Plantinga is a very intelligent guy. I personally think that Plantinga's syllogism is wholly reliant upon a I would not say it relies upon an idea that there are multiple possible universes, and when we look at Plantinga's syllogism, which is the one that I read to you, you were right. You were right to suggest it is entirely reliant upon premise 1. With the maximally great island syllogism, you have to look at the idea that they're trying to insert an inanimate object into a syllogism talking wholly about God. So with Anselm and what he's trying to do with this argument is he's trying to say that that God is necessarily existent if it's even possible that God exists. So I think Anselm's syllogism does not his syllogism. His argument is rather weak, just upon those premises. But we have to also look at the idea that critics of this argument are going to say that it's wholly difficult to understand. It's way too difficult for a common person to understand. So I think that is where it falls short. So ultimately, when we look at Anselm's argument, I think that is one of the flaws of the argument. It's not simple. It's not, the syllogism itself is not simple. It tends to lean towards the idea that a maximally great being exists wholly on the possibility that his existence is contingent upon the possibility of his existence and the possibility of him being maximally great. So I think that is one of the shortfallings of this argument. And I'm not a fan of the argument. I tend to lean more towards transcendental arguments and natural arguments more than the philosophical proofs for God's existence. Even though I do think those are fun arguments to discuss, this is definitely a fun argument to discuss in the classroom. I tend to joke that you need to take aspirin before you discuss Anselm's ontological argument, because it is head-splitting. It does tend to make you overthink things. But even Thomas Aquinas has criticized Anselm's argument. He said the idea here is that since different people have different concepts of God, this argument does really work, but it only works to convince the notion of God. So if we're going to discuss the notion of the possibility of there possibly being a maximally great being, then this argument would work. To put kind of the seed of the idea of God into people's minds. But if we're going to discuss religion with people, the existence of a necessary religion, then this argument would fall short.
Okay, well, that kind of creates a couple of potential issues that I see. And you can actually break down, if we go back to Anselm's core syllogism, it makes things quite a bit easier to understand and deal with. Excuse me. So his breaks down into simply three syllogisms and three premises and a conclusion. Excuse me. Premise one is either God exists in the understanding but not in reality, or God exists in the understanding and in reality. So we have an X and Y there. In premise two, if God exists in the understanding but not in reality, then we can conceive of a thing greater than God, a thing different in virtue of existing in the understanding and reality, but otherwise just like God. And then premise three, it is not the case that we can conceive of a thing greater than God. Conclusion, God exists in the understanding and reality. It has a couple of issues, though, because when you break it down into the simple X, Y for particular statements, you get God exists in the understanding but not in reality is X, and God existing in the understanding and in reality is Y. But in premise 2, we have an if X then Z situation.
Mm-hmm.
And then premise 3 comes back and says it is not the case that Z, therefore Y. But something that we have an issue with, and this was brought up by Hume, Kant, even Bertrand Russell, and that is that existence is not a property.
Yeah, you're right, and you're actually reading his first argument. He actually released the second one too, and the second one is, by definition, God is as a being than which none greater can be imagined. Premise 2, a being that necessarily exists in reality is greater than a being that does not necessarily exist. Premise 3 is, thus, by definition, if God exists as an idea in the mind but does not necessarily exist in the reality, then we can imagine something that is greater than God. Premise 4, but we cannot imagine something that is greater than God. Premise 5, thus, if God exists in the mind as an idea, then God necessarily exists in reality. Premise 6, God exists in the mind as an idea. Premise 7, therefore, God necessarily exists in reality. That's the second one, and that's where he gets rid of the if X and Z idea. And I think that his second version of the argument is definitely stronger. I think that it still does have its weaknesses, mostly in premise 3 and 4. It says, thus, by definition, premise 3, if God exists as an idea in the mind but does not necessarily exist in reality, then we can imagine something that is greater than God.
Well, at that point, we need to actually explore some definitional aspects of things, such as, okay, what is a maximally great being? And the closest definition that I can kind of find that seems to be contemporary is a being that possesses all qualities that are better to have, which were defined as great-making properties. So, what are those great-making properties?
Well, I think the classical definition of God, all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good, would be the great-making properties. All-powerful meaning that he has the ability to create and to destroy on will. All-knowing, he knows all things, including all contingent possibilities. And then all good means that he only make decisions that are good for the reality in which he created.
Okay, so, but one thing we kind of have to look into is, are the three omnis, are omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence, are those actually great-making properties? Because if it's a great-making property, well, that means it's a quality that is better to have in all circumstances and in all possible worlds. But we can easily conceive of perhaps a possible world in which at least one of those would not be a good thing to have, which would not be better to have, like omniscience, for instance. Okay, if we're talking about all possible worlds, then in possibility there is a world in which there exists nothing but pain, suffering, strife, pretty much everything bad and nothing good. And if that's the case and you are omniscient, well, that's not exactly a good thing to have, because now you are suddenly aware of all of those things.
Okay. Well, that's where the omnibenevolence would come in.
Okay, but even so, regardless of omnibenevolence, if it's a world, and since we're talking about all possible worlds, which means a world like this must be, by possibility, nothing but pain, suffering, strife, all the bad things, no good things, omniscience would not be better to have. So at that point, you can argue that omniscience is not a great making property.
Well, don't get me defending Molinism. I'm not going to.
I'm not trying to get you to defend anything in particular. I'm just analyzing the argument and seeing what I can come up with here. I mean, because also, I can even think of reasons that omnipotence would not be a great making property, such as what if you look at two distinct situations. Well, that's where better to have comes in. Is it better to have an axe or a fishing pole? It's entirely dependent on the situation. But if you're omnipotent, of course, you have the power to do anything at all times. But what if you just want to, say, lack responsibility?
What do you mean by that?
If you just want to lack responsibility, like if you're omnipotent, you have the power to do all things. And going back to the age-old Marvel Comics Spider-Man ism from Uncle Ben, with great power comes great responsibility. So with all the power comes all the responsibility. What if you just want to not have responsibility? At that point, you have to sacrifice omnipotence. Otherwise, omnipotence is not a great-making property.
I think that's a false dichotomy.
How would it be a false dichotomy?
You can be omnipotent and not take responsibility for another lesser being's actions.
It's not about taking responsibility. It's about having it. By taking responsibility for an action, yes. But if you are omniscient and omnipotent, means you know about it, and you have the responsibility of wielding such power. So if you want to lack responsibility, you cannot lack responsibility if you are omnipotent, because with all power comes all responsibility.
So where the dichotomy would come in is, just because you know of something, does that make you responsible for it?
Well, I mean, if you're God and you exist in all possible worlds, and there's a world with nothing but suffering, and you're God, which means you made that world, so yes, you're responsible for it.
Well, number one, I'm not going to defend Molinism. This is a strictly Molinistic argument, but I'm not going to defend it. And if we were going to go back to the Thomistic side, as opposed to the Molinistic side, we would pull up the reality of first and secondary causes,
except the causes don't matter at that point, because all we're talking about are these great-making properties of omniscience, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence.
You brought in omniscience, and you brought in the idea that to know something makes you responsible for it.
Right.
If you do not stop it, then that somehow makes you responsible for that evil thing taking place. That would bring us into a necessary conversation on causality. So that's why I brought in the first and secondary causes. And all we would say in reference to that is that an omniscient, omnipotent being would be the first cause of all things. The secondary cause is where the intent comes in, which is what makes it evil. If God intends for something to happen, but he necessarily says that his intention is for good, but we cause this thing to happen, and our intent is for evil, God is not responsible for our evil. And that's where that would come in. And we see this playing out in the real world too. In a police sting operation, they set up a scenario. They cause a scenario that would necessarily cause two opposing forces to come together. One has an evil intent. The police do not have an evil intent. Their only intent is to have a good thing happen, which is the capturing of the bad guys. Um, so the police's intent was setting up, let's say, a drug deal, is to catch the bad guys. There's an evil thing happening in that the evil people are trying to sell a mass quantity of drugs into an inner city, but the police are going to try to stop them by doing the sting operation. The police cause the operation, but the evil guys are the ones that have the evil intent to make it happen. So that is a real world scenario that plays into the first and secondary causes. So we can see these things happen in real life. Who says that they can't happen on a cosmic level?
Well, you also still do have arguments from defense attorneys in that particular analogy that you brought up, in that they could argue that depending on the circumstances, and I don't have any references off the top of my head since this is kind of off the cuff, but where they've argued against the sting operation as entrapment.
Well, it is entrapment, but at the same time, sting operations still happen, and they still catch the bad guys, and the bad guys are still put behind bars. So we can say that there are arguments against it in the real world, but there's no evil intent happening on the base of the police, and the bad guys still end up behind bars 9 times out of 10, and ultimately, when push comes to shove, uh, sting operations actually do work, and they're still used to this day. There are multiple ICE raids going on around the United States to catch illegal immigrants. The ICE is not an evil entity. They go in, they raid facilities, they capture illegal immigrants, they send them back to their countries. That's just the reality of the situation. It's not an inherently evil thing to do, but uh, in all honesty, when we look at the situation of first and secondary causes, even well-known atheists have defended the idea that there are cause and effect that happens that can set up this idea of, um, there is a primary cause and there's a secondary cause, and the secondary cause is where the intent comes in. Whether an action is evil or good depends on that secondary cause. This is a well-known philosophical idea that's accepted by both secularists and theists as well. So I really don't see where this can be refuted.
Okay.
Well, I think that we've hit that one into the dirt enough. I think we're just beating a dead horse now. We can go
Okay.
into the cosmological argument if you want.
Oh, sure. Yeah, we can do that. I didn't say anything after that because I thought it sounded like you were pausing for something. So, let's see. If I remember right, your preferred cosmological argument was the Kalam. Would that be correct?
Yeah.
Okay, so for anyone who's not heard of the Kalam cosmological argument, it's really very simple. It's often used by an apologist by the name of William Lane Craig. Uh, and it simply goes, whatever begins to exist has a cause for its coming into being. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause for its coming into being.
Yeah, it's a three-step syllogism. I actually have a different one, a different syllogism that's worded a little bit differently. All things are moved by something else. The first mover must be God. Second, all things are caused by something else. The first cause must be God. Third, all things are contingent. The only non-contingent being that causes all contingent things to be must be God. Um, and that's a more simplified argument. It's not William Lane Craig's argument. Um, but I think you did read Craig's argument, if I remember correctly.
Well, Craig uses the core Kalam argument. Um, but also what yours does was yours actually just kind of smashes a few different ones together, like it pulls Aquinas' first way, really just combines almost all of Aquinas' initial 5 ways.
Yeah, I think Kalam had a very simplistic argument. Whatever begins to exist has a cause, being the first premise, and ending with therefore the universe has a cause. He doesn't actually actually intend to evoke God into that argument until a later edition of this argument. Then he starts to evoke God as being an unmoved mover, or an uncaused cause. Um, but that's essentially where it is going, is is towards the idea of God. And I think that this has a weakness to it. It kind of creates the idea that there could possibly be a domino effect to creation, as in God lit a match and then everything just um, uh, came out blindly,
Mm-hmm.
uh, of that initial lighting of the match. And I think that that could be a necessary weakness to the argument itself. It just depends on the person ultimately, about how far they're going to take this argument. But it's the most common argument for the existence of God,
Yeah.
and that it kind of tries to insinuate that, well, the natural starting point for most things, like if you're going to read a book, you're going to read a book from the beginning. So we need to start from the beginning. Uh, what caused the universe? What caused us to exist necessarily? So I think that that's the reason why most people start with this argument, and it's more of a common sense argument too. Most Christians think that this argument is definitely a common sense thing, that, if we believe in God, then therefore we must start with God. So um, I think that that's the necessary common sense point for most people, is to start from the beginning of the universe, since everything has a starting point, therefore God must exist. um, so I think that that's necessarily where this argument uh, tries to take us, and necessarily why people start there in the first place.
Okay. Well, there's a couple of things that I take issue with, and I'm primarily going to key in on your the unmoved mover that you brought up, and that is that the unmoved mover that relies on Aristotelian physics, and those don't apply anymore. They actually, for the most part, never really applied, because a lot of it depends on uh, perfect rotation or perfect celestial precession, things like that. And when that happens, when that comes up, we run into a few issues, because we know that there's no perfect celestial precession. And if anything, going back to Aristotle's initial unmoved mover argument, whereas Aquinas essentially just kind of shoehorns God in as an explanation towards the end of it, you find that at best it's kind of an argument for uh, natural laws, kind of specifically the law of gravity.
Well, no one necessarily says that this argument has anything to do with natural laws, or says that it doesn't have anything to do with natural laws. Where we mostly where Christians mostly use this argument is to explain how the universe began. So with with this argument, I think that its main weakness is that it can drive someone into a sort of deism, not necessarily all the way towards theism or Christian theism, even though this is one of the more popular arguments from the Christian perspective, necessarily. So when it comes to the cosmological argument, um, the Christian looks at this argument, and it says, wow, this argument answers a lot of questions, which, it's a fun thing to think about. Like I said with the last one, it's a fun thing to think about. The universe had a cause, therefore the cause must be an uncaused cause. And the classic theist thinks of, God as an uncaused being. So ultimately, I think that that is that is the reason why most Christians use this. So when we look at the Kalam argument, we're looking at an argument that says, well, I'm not necessarily going to take you towards any particular religion. I'm just going to try to convince you of the existence of God, basically.
Okay, so it looks like we're having some technical difficulties. Let's see. And it looks like I'm actually going to have to turn a light on here. Okay. Okay. All right, folks, we're going to get this tech issue sorted out, and then we are going to come back to this in just a moment. There we go. Make sure this is showing up. Okay, good. Okay, and we got you back live.
Whoop, whoop.
Okay, folks, and we're back.
Having a little bit of a cam issue here. So,
Yeah.
all right. Well, with I think we're on the Kalam argument. With the Kalam argument, I think one of the main weaknesses is, like I said, it doesn't lead you towards any defined religious definition of God. What it does is it leads you into an idea that of God that says God exists, but he's not a personal being. He is a being of of enough power to create the universe, but after that it kind of falls short. So I think that that's the main issue with the Kalam argument, from at least a Christian perspective. But at the same time, could it be weaker? I guess it could, but it's a really short, simple syllogism that many atheists tear down, mostly on the basis of the science and not necessarily on the philosophy aspect of it. Philosophically, it's logical. That the universe had to have a starting point that is uncaused, therefore God. So philosophically, I guess it's pretty strong. My issue is where it takes you necessarily.
Well, most philosophers would actually even argue that it's not even really that philosophically strong. Is it logically valid? Sure. But it doesn't really, it has the appearance of soundness, but it's not guaranteed to be sound, because you do have potential issues that crop up, such as the non-applicability of Aristotelian physics, which at the very least the unmoved mover very much completely relies on. And so it relies on the perfect precession of the planets and other celestial bodies, which we know they don't. And science has given us that, and science is born of philosophy. So, in essence, you could very well argue that the largest independent branch of philosophy doesn't really agree with it.
Well, it's not as if the universe couldn't have been created in a state where, you know, cosmic accidents and collisions don't happen. To say that God can create something imperfect is not outside of the scope of theology. Unless you're having an issue with the theology of the argument, I really don't see where your objection to that would actually be an issue. My objections are strictly theological more so than philosophical. Philosophically, the argument is sound, and is logical, and it's logically applicable as well. So I really don't see an issue with the philosophy behind it. I do see something wrong with the theology behind it.
Well, what can be wrong with the philosophy of it is looking at the whole argument from causes at that point. Because, okay, we understand that, to the best of our knowledge, cause and effect works within our universe. But that becomes a fallacy of composition at that point. Because the whole is not necessarily the sum of its parts. You know, such as we can say, look at a wall. A wall is comprised of bricks. So, for analogous purposes, the universe is the wall, and the bricks are all these little causes and effects going back and forth, interacting with each other. The wall is made up of bricks. The wall is brick, but there are aspects of the bricks that do not apply to the wall. For instance, okay, we build this wall, just call it 8 by 10 feet for no other purpose than just it's 8 by 10 feet. The wall's not small at that point, unless you're comparing it to other things of equivalent property, other walls. So, because the wall does not share that property with the brick, that does not necessarily follow that the universe shares that possibility, that cause and effect property outside the universe.
I mean, that makes sense. But the Aristotelian categories, I really don't think are necessarily contingent in this argument.
Well, they would have to be, because Aquinas is using Aristotle's argument.
I know Aquinas uses a lot of Aristotle, period. He uses Aristotle in his definition of transubstantiation. That's not necessarily my issue. Aristotelian categories kind of goes into all of Western thought, period. So ultimately, I think that, and we're about to wrap up, but ultimately, I think that when it comes to what you were trying to get at was that the properties of the universe necessarily have to play a part in how we explain the argument, and I agree with that. And I think Anselm was a little bit limited in his explanation in the argument, and that's probably why his syllogism was so short, is because he didn't have all the knowledge that we have today about how the universe works. And I think that's another shortfalling for the argument. But like I said earlier, I don't think there's any philosophical or logical issues with the argument. I think the main issues with the argument are strictly theological on my end.
Okay. So, but how would you answer questions like that? Because, for instance, if it's relying on the universe, how the universe began, and trying to explain that, and we look at, for lack of a better term, the beginning of the universe, well, we can't really say that's the beginning, because when you look at it from a scientific perspective, it all goes back to a point of singularity. It's at that point when the Big Bang occurs, not at the point of singularity. but at the instant of the Big Bang, that is where time starts. So if that's where time starts, then time, by definition, didn't exist. So there is no really before the Big Bang. And so with that in mind, since all these things happen at once, you can't really separate the two.
No, I get what you're saying. And like I said, these arguments are not arguments that I would typically use, because my particular field of apologetics is not classical. Even though I think these arguments are fun things to think about, I think that, and on later shows we'll get into the teleological argument, the design argument, the moral argument, and arguments like that. And I think all of these arguments, they can only go up to a certain point of explaining things. And typically the approach that is used when using these arguments is a probability approach. It is more probable that God exists than for a God not to exist. And my language there was actually intentional, a God. Not necessarily the Christian God, but a God. And I think that when we look at other religions and things like that, I'm not going to defend them because that's not the religion I belong to. And that's one of the shortfallings of the classical approach. You cannot prove a particular religion through the classical apologetics approach. You can through other approaches. Islam has their particular field. Reformed Christianity has its particular set of arguments for its position. And Catholicism has turned into a big tent religion anyways. And I would actually argue that they've always been that way. Even though, as all of us know, take a step back 500 years, and Catholicism wasn't really accepting of other religions. Now they, since Vatican II at least, they have tended towards a big tent view of themselves, and in and of that, they believe that their truth can be spread upon all other religions and all other peoples through a type of ignorance of Catholicism. So if you do not intentionally deny Roman Catholicism, then you are accepted under their idea of a gracious God, that God would grant you salvation because of your ignorance. So that tends to be the case, and why Roman Catholics tend to use this sort of argumentation, because they're not necessarily concerned with actually getting people to Catholicism. They're more concerned with getting people to an idea of God. So that's a good starting point for these arguments, but how do you really hit it home for the Christian? How does a Christian say, well, we're going to get you from the idea of a God to the idea of the Christian God? And I think William Lane Craig tries his best. I think Frank Turek tries his best. I think Ravi Zacharias tries his best to go on and say, well, then we have to look at the historicity of Jesus. And they go there. And I think that's an okay approach, I guess. It takes more authority off of where the authority is supposed to be in our religion, but that tends to be the next step. Well, you've gotten to the idea of the possibility of God existing. Now we need to get to the idea of Jesus existing, and Jesus being real, and Jesus' death being real, and then Jesus' resurrection being real. And that it tends to be an infinite regress along those lines until the person finally comes to the idea of, okay, so it's actually possible that all of this stuff is true. Therefore, I might as well swing the back or punch my ticket towards this religion and see if it works.
Okay, well, yeah, that does sound like a really good starting point for our discussions on arguments for the existence of God, and we've heard some good stuff from your side. I don't really think that the refutations or the objections that I'm offering, both from myself and also from other perspectives, other philosophical perspectives, they don't really seem to have an efficient or effective answer for it, because no matter what's been offered thus far, there seem to still be objections to that, and we'll probably get more into that in a different video. One thing I would like to do before we close out is going to announce that we are going to be doing a stream tomorrow, and it's going to involve an individual who I've recently become aware of by the name of Ryan Merkel. He has what appears to be an original thought on something that he calls the quadrant model theory. And if anybody wants to look at that before tomorrow, they can look at quadrantmodelofreality.com. I will see if I can put a link in the description down below after this live stream posts after we end. So, Anthony, before we close, would you like to put a shameless plug in for where people can find you and whatnot?
Yep, my main platform right now is going to be Facebook. We're currently trying to rebuild our website. So our website is formerly named theancientfaith.com, the-ancient-faith.com. But we are currently in the process of rebuilding that website. So you can probably still see the old website still up, but we haven't added any new content because of the rebuild. But once we get the rebuild done, we'll launch that. But our main platform at the moment is going to be the Reform View blog on Facebook. So you can look up the Reform View on Facebook. You'll easily find us. Our background picture is a large chamber with a bunch of people with the Reform View blog in really big letters, so it's not really that hard to find. Or you can just find me on Anthony W. Brooks on Facebook. And then hopefully by the next episode, we'll have a rebuild done, and we'll be able to actually plug that into the description.
All right, that'll be great. And for anybody that doesn't know, I'm Drew, and this is the Atheist Reformation. You can find me here on YouTube. You can also send me an email at theatheistreformation@gmail.com if you want to be on the show, think you have an interesting philosophical perspective to offer, or just want to discuss something relating to religion, theism, atheism, and communicating that, or even science communication. We're open to just about everything. All right, well, everybody, thanks again, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow, and you will also see me tomorrow for sure on the Reason and Theology channel. There will be a roundtable discussion, so feel free to tune into that tomorrow morning, and we look forward to seeing you there. Thank you, and have a great night.